Asbestos has and continues to be used in thousands of different materials such as flooring, ceiling texture, and plasters. Asbestos-containing materials in good condition, if left alone, should not pose a danger. However, if you're planning to renovate or disturb these materials, harmful cancer-causing fibers can be released into the air unless you take special precautions. Missouri-certified asbestos inspectors should be contacted if demolition or renovation activities are planned in regulated structures. If removal or major repairs are needed, people trained and qualified in handling asbestos should also be contacted.
Most people associate asbestos use with building or automotive materials. Chrysotile, or white asbestos, was also used as artificial snow in the motion picture industry. Keep that in mind the next time you are watching White Christmas or It's a Wonderful Life during the holidays, or the scene in The Wizard of Oz where Dorothy falls asleep in the poppy field. Asbestos was also used in stage curtains and panels on stage lighting. Woven asbestos-containing materials can include gasket or rope materials. These were used in items such as valve packings and door seals on boilers, furnaces, and pressure vessels. Asbestos was, and still is in some places, added to roofing products. These include roofing felts, ceiling mastics, and shingles. We are still seeing the import of some roofing materials with asbestos into the U.S. today. Flooring products are another material where asbestos was widely used. A good rule of thumb is to assume any floor tile measuring 9 inches by 9 inches or smaller contains asbestos. It's not found frequently, but some 12-inch by 12-inch floor tile may also contain asbestos. Black floor mastics also typically contain asbestos. Sheet flooring or linoleum can contain asbestos in the vapor barrier or the underlayment of the material. When linoleum is removed, it's not uncommon for the vapor barrier to stay glued down to the wood floor beneath. This separation of the flooring layers will result in a high probability of a significant release of asbestos fibers. Spray-on or troweled-on textures with asbestos were applied to interior walls and ceilings, primarily for their acoustical properties and to improve fire resistance. These applications are common in auditoriums, schoolrooms, hallways, and on structural beams. It's believed some of the asbestos contamination that occurred following 9/11 was due to the spray-on fireproofing on the beams in the Twin Towers. Preformed pipe insulation was used widely to insulate steam, hot water, cold water, and condensate return lines in many settings. Not all preformed insulation contains asbestos, but unless it can be shown otherwise, you should assume that it does. Paper seam tape was used to seal the joints in HVAC ductwork in both residential and commercial settings. Cementitious siding, commonly called transite, can be found on the exterior walls and roofs of many older buildings. Siding can be small individual pieces or larger panels. Roofing materials are typically 4x8 sheets, but can also be flat or corrugated shingles. When removing cementitious products, care needs to be taken to minimize breakage. Asbestos is a corrugated metal sheet that has been coated with an asphaltic asbestos coating. It's typically used as roofing and exterior walls in industrial buildings. Perforated transite panels were commonly used in music rooms, recording studios, radio stations, and sound chambers. Asbestos was added to the fill material used inside institutional and industrial cooling towers. You can also find transite panels used on the cooling fins and the exterior walls of cooling towers. A mine near Libby, Montana was the source of over 70% of the vermiculite sold in the U.S. up until 1990. Asbestos deposits in the mine caused contamination of the vermiculite. Vermiculite insulation was often marketed as zonalite. You can find vermiculite inside cinder block walls, attics, and in the cavities of conventional stud wall construction. Vermiculite will settle over time, so it may not be apparent high up on a wall. If a hole is made to inspect for the presence of vermiculite, be prepared to have some means to quickly plug it back up. Some asbestos or demolition inspections may include work in areas such as tunnels, manholes, or vaults. These are considered confined spaces. If an area requires a confined space entry permit, you should not conduct any work in that space. Confined spaces where there are no concerns for hazardous atmospheres such as low oxygen or other serious safety or health considerations may be inspected at your discretion. If you have any concerns or are uncomfortable in working in these areas, entry is not required. You should also be aware of any requirements for personal protective equipment such as hard hats, steel-toed shoes, safety harnesses, disposable clothing, or respirators. Keep in mind when you're doing your job, the number one cause of injuries on the job are slips, trips, and falls. Look at debris in tunnels and watch where you're walking, watch your headroom, be careful going down ladders. Here's a prime example of a slip, trip, and fall hazard inside a steam tunnel. You can see the water, the condensation on the floor. You can also see an open trough in the floor. You can easily step in that, twist a knee, break an ankle, do whatever. So be aware of your environment. Mold is another hazard you can find in buildings. There are thousands of species of mold. Mold can cause several reactions, including allergies, eye irritation, or respiratory problems. If you encounter moldy odors or visible mold, or know you'll be entering damp, humid areas, you should be using proper respiratory protection. A HEPA filter and organic vapor cartridge should be adequate protection against mold and odors. If you're looking at insulated steam lines or water lines, occasionally you'll find them covered with an aluminum or a metal jacket of some kind, and they're banded on. You need to look underneath that jacket at some point to see what kind of insulation you'll find. This particular piping has yellow fiberglass batting underneath it. Just because you find fiberglass, you do not know if that fiberglass is by chance covering up the original old asbestos-containing insulation, so you need to either make a core sample all the way down to the pipe, or else you need to find a damaged or exposed piece on the pipe and make a visual inspection on your own. Another building material that's frequently overlooked in asbestos inspections performed by contractors is the electrical wiring. The cloth insulation on the outside of old wirings is known to have asbestos in it. If you're doing a follow-up inspection or an oversight inspection in a building, you need to be sure and look at pipe chases and electrical runs to see what kind of wiring you may encounter. You can also find asbestos inside the switch boxes or electrical boxes. Those can contain transformer panels or paper back behind them to prevent fires or help suppress fires. Here's an example of an electrical fuse box. You can see the paper back behind the fuse block itself there. That paper would be considered a friable material. The cloth on the wiring, if it was brand new and in good condition, it would be a category 2 non-friable, but if it's really deteriorated, really old, chances are it should be handled as a regulated material. If you're ever working around electrical fuse boxes or switches or anything, make sure they're de-energized before you even get up close and personal to them. What we're looking at here is a steam tunnel with some severely damaged thermal system insulation on it. This is a preformed insulation. It comes in halves. It covers up both half of the pipe, and then they cover it up with either a lag cloth or else some kind of a wrapped. If you're going into a situation like this, this is a very hazardous environment. You do not want to go in here unless you absolutely have to. Something else to consider, you need to be up on your tetanus boosters and stuff like that. If you go down there and scratch yourself, cut yourself, or who knows what, that's the last thing you need is something else besides asbestosis. Another way of identifying a pipe insulation or any kind of insulation is a fiberglass material. If it's not readily visible, if you can't see the pink or the yellow stuff underneath. If you look at the outside wrap here, you can see these thin string striations that run the length of the insulation. They're in between the outside paper layer and the fiberglass material underneath. Just kind of gives extra support to the outside layer. Here's an example of a fire door. These are not at all uncommon in institutional buildings, bank buildings, schools and whatnot. This is it's a metal jacketed on the outside. They're real heavy duty. On the inside of this, there will be an asbestos material. Typically it's a thick layer of transite. These doors are considered a non-regulated, non-friable asbestos-containing material, provided proper work practices are used. Typically, when people take these off, they will essentially remove them from the hinges and dispose of them intact without disturbing the inner core. Something else to keep in mind when you're looking at long runs of piping, even though the material may appear to be replaced or intact, or it's a new fiberglass material, it's not at all unusual to find lengths of newer replaced material overlain by patch material to asbestos material back to fiberglass again. So you need to be sure and examine the entire length of the pipe run that you're looking at. Something else that you can encounter when you're doing work in old buildings, even though you're the asbestos guy, you should be somewhat knowledgeable about other program requirements as well. This is an example of a dry electrical transformer as opposed to a wet one. The wet ones, you'll find the PCB containing dielectric transformer oil. This one does not. This is a dry unit, doesn't have the oils in it. It's just to let you know, one kind of something you can run into. All right, asbestos-containing materials you can find on the exterior buildings include window glazings or window caulks. If you look at this building here, you can see it's got blue paint on it. It's starting to alligator. Usually that alligator paint is another symbol of, or it's symptomatic of lead-based paint as well. So we've got two issues here, both asbestos-containing materials inside the caulk or the glazing, as well as the lead paint component. If you look at the paint on the ceiling of this building, you'll notice it's starting to alligator and delaminate from the ceiling itself. That's usually you'll find like a lead-based paint or a paint with a lot of metals content in it. If the building is going to be demolished and the paint's in this bad a condition, they'd have to come in and have some kind of abatement done ahead of time and characterize that paint for record metals and potentially handle it as a hazardous waste. If that paint's actually in good condition and intact, there's no need to do any kind of abatement or removal prior to demolition. This is an older style light fixture. The thing on light fixtures, what you need to be aware of, you can find, or you will find, PCB containing ballast in these fixtures, and then you also need to consider the bulbs themselves because of the mercury content or the mercury vapors inside those. These would both be considered universal waste under RCRA and should be removed prior to demolition and properly handled and disposed of or recycled. And here's just a different style fluorescent fixture, probably a newer light. Here's an example of a couple of different types of fluorescent bulbs in a fixture. As we said earlier, chances are quite good you need to consider the possibility of PCB ballast in these lights as well. If you look at these two different kinds of bulbs, you'll notice the ends are different. One has a green cap, one has a silver cap. The silver cap one is an older bulb. It'll have higher mercury content, higher metal content, and the vapors in it. The green bulb is a newer bulb. It's a lower mercury bulb. Both of those would still be considered as a universal waste under RCRA. Another building component to keep in mind is the brick materials and floor materials, concrete, asphalt materials. If you get into a building, an older building, and it's got glazed type bricks such as this one, typically if they actually do an analysis on those, you'll find high contents of lead and other metals. So that needs to be taken into consideration as to, are they going to use these on site as clean fill, or what kind of work practice is going to be used, or how they need to be disposed of. That may need to be handled as a special waste underneath the solid waste program. Ceiling tiles, drop ceiling tiles are another asbestos containing material you can find. There's a lot of different styles and shapes and configurations of tiles. These would be considered a friable asbestos containing material. It's not often that you will find asbestos in ceiling tiles. Typically when you do encounter that, it's in like school buildings, big box buildings. You need to be careful when you remove those kind of materials. Proper work practices are essential. And when you look at a ceiling tile, be sure and lift it up and look to see if there's a plaster ceiling above it. Typically there's multiple ceiling layers in older buildings. Ceiling plasters are another common asbestos containing material you'll find in older buildings. Not all ceiling plasters will have asbestos, but again, it's not uncommon. If you look at ceiling plasters on profile, you'll find either a 2 or a 3 coat plaster. In older buildings, in metropolitan St. Louis or older municipalities like that, typically if you look at a piece of sample and you see fibrous material sticking out of it, it's not uncommon for that to be horsehair. If you're looking at plaster materials, or you may find just a single layer of plaster on top of the metal lathe, or you could find multiple layers. If you find what they call a 2 or 3 coat plaster, generally if you find the asbestos, it will be in the last layer applied, the scratch coat. Another common asbestos containing material that you'll find in buildings is floor tiles. There's many different sizes and colors of floor tiles. We're looking at a 12 by 12 floor tiles. A general rule of thumb, 12 by 12 tiles typically are not asbestos containing, but every now and then you can find it, so you do need to make sure they're sampled. Another problem with floor tiles is the analytical technique. They're hard to analyze using conventional polarized light microscopy. It may need to be TEM'd or something, or point counted. Other thing, floor tile are considered a non-friable, typically non-regulated asbestos containing material, but it's contingent on the condition of the material as well as the work practice that's going to be used. These particular tiles have got wet and floated off of the floor, and while they may have been resilient when they were put down, if they were at all brittle at the time they were removed, they may need to be handled as a regulated asbestos containing material. Another common flooring product in older buildings is 9 by 9 floor tiles. General rule of thumb, 9 by 9s, 99% of the time they will come back to be an asbestos containing material. Again, like all flooring products, these are considered a non-friable category 1 material. It all comes down to the condition they're in at the time they're going to be removed, as well as the work practice that's going to be used. Something else to keep in mind is the mastic that's underneath these tiles. If you lift the tile and you find a black mastic, it's very probable that mastic will be asbestos containing as well. If you find a brown or a yellow mastic, the chances are not as high, but then again, it's not unheard of. So something else, if you're looking at Flooring, keep in mind that you can find multiple layers of flooring. It's not at all uncommon to find 2 or 3 layers of floor tile, a layer of linoleum, a layer of subfloor, and more flooring on top of that. So be sure and go all the way to the bottom when you're looking. Something else that's common to encounter during inspections in older buildings are chemicals. This 3M paint, for example, if you look at the label, it's a flammable liquid and a vapor. Old chemicals will need to be characterized to determine if they should be managed as a hazardous waste, or else a legitimate beneficial reuse will have to be identified. Something you may occasionally run into in a former manufacturing facility are compressed gas cylinders. Depending on what's in those cylinders, they may or may not need to be properly managed or characterized and disposed of. If they're empty, they may just be salvage metal. Here's an example of some drying ovens. These particular ovens were used to manufacture car license plates. If you're going to be inspecting these buildings or you're going to be collecting bulk samples, you'd need to look underneath the exterior skin on these for transite or some other kind of preformed block materials. It's not all uncommon to find either transite or the preformed materials, particularly in high heat applications like around ovens and boilers and things like that. Something to keep in mind too, if you find preformed block materials, typically you'll run into, that's one of the few applications where you'll find amosite asbestos around high heat applications. The majority of the time what you're going to run into is chrysotile asbestos. One of the unique things about amosite being used around high heat is that it will not take water like chrysotile containing materials will, and that's one of the essentials in work practices, so always keep that in mind. Here's an example of air cell pipe insulation. This is it's a paper insulation. It's got this characteristic appearance. If you look at it on the end, it looks like a corrugated cardboard box. This is a really friable material. It's a regulated asbestos containing material. Air cell will always come back positive. Earlier we looked at some preformed pieces of pipe insulation. Sometimes those come back positive, sometimes they're negative. Air cell will always test positive. Here's an example of an insulated steam line. It's got 2 kinds of asbestos insulation on it. On the pipe run itself there, it's got preformed halves that you can see that's got the metal clad on the outside held in place with the steel bands. If you look at the elbow, you can see a mudded insulation which is formed in place over that fitting. Both of those would be considered examples of friable asbestos containing materials. Something else to keep an eye for when you're looking through an old building or an old manufacturing facility is like old paint cleaners or old parts cleaners. Here's an example of an old parts cleaner. It's no longer in use, but it's still got some liquid in it. It's still got the solvent smell to it. If it's still full, it needs to be properly emptied and those materials properly managed. Here's another example of where you can find asbestos similar to a fire door. Here's another example of a fire door. This is a building safe. These are quite heavy. If you look at the, you'll find the asbestos in between the metal cladding on the exterior doors. You can find examples of this both in safes as well as in file cabinets. Here's another example of surface texture on an interior wall. Here's an example of a exterior plaster with a textured material on it. Textured materials, if they're even spray applied or hand applied, are considered a suspect material, and those always need to be sampled and characterized accordingly. These would always be considered a friable or a regulated asbestos containing material when they're removed. Here's an example of an up-close example of the texturing that's been applied to this plaster on the outside of this cell block. It breaks easy, would be considered a regulated material if it was asbestos containing. Here's another example of a material we've found in a building. Particular building we're standing in right now used to have a dry cleaning facility in it. Here's a can of multi-fabric detergent. It's exclusively for use in perchloroethylene machines. Perchloroethylene would be regulated as both an air pollutant as well as a hazardous waste. So be sure and take note of cans like that. If you ever encounter a drum of any kind of an unknown in this condition or not, and it's not labeled, and you're not experienced and you're not an emergency responder, do not do anything on your own to try and figure out what's in it. Don't take the bung off of it. Don't sniff vapors coming out of it. Don't stick your finger in it, and don't kick it. Your worst case scenario, that will be some kind of an unstable material. Here's an example of a fan unit. While this particular unit doesn't have it, it's not uncommon to find on the exhaust side of this fan there will be a piece of flexible duct dampener in between the actual fan unit itself and the duct that it connects to. That dampener is in there to remove vibration or take vibrations out of the duct when the fan's running. Usually that cloth, it would be considered a Category 2 non-friable unregulated material. When it's new out of the box, unfortunately over time it will tend to deteriorate and should probably be handled as a regulated material when it's removed. Here's an example of the brake shoes that are underneath an elevator. This is the primary brake shoe that's responsible for stopping the car. There's also a set of emergency brake shoes underneath the car itself. Here's an example of a built-up roof. Roofing materials in general, they're considered non-regulated, non-friable materials if they're in good conditions. Built-up roofs like this, you can find asbestos in both all the mastics and the flashings and the joints are underneath the felts. Generally the rubber membrane, you won't find it in there. If you look at the roof vents on this, you can find asbestos in the black mastic where it seals the joints up around there as well. For roofing materials, if it's in good condition and it's going to be removed using either a roof plow or else manual methods, it's considered unregulated. If you ever use any kind of a saw or a roof saw on that, you've got a different threshold to consider. Rather than 160 square feet, which you normally look at for NESHAP purposes, it's 5,580 square feet to look at specific to roofing. So if you're going to saw a roof and it's got asbestos in it and it's more than 5,580 square feet, you're going to have to use a registered contractor. Here's an example of some 3-tab shingles that are in bad condition. Normally roofing materials in good condition are considered a non-regulated, non-friable material. In this particular case here, these are weathered to the point that whoever does the initial inspection on these and pulls bulk samples, if they come back to be asbestos containing, would probably call this friable asbestos containing material. Keep in mind when you're looking at roofing projects, it's not at all uncommon to find multiple layers of roofing. While 3-tab shingles typically are not asbestos containing, you can find asbestos in both the felt underlayment as well as at in the mastics for the flashings where the joints over. Exterior items that are often overlooked are soffit and fascia materials. Transite panels have also been found in the ceilings of walkways or even around the canopies over fuel islands at gas stations. Since we've looked at examples of materials in schools, here are a few more building materials or components you could encounter. Here's a chalkboard. Here's a fume hood. Fire curtains are something you could encounter as well. Here's an example of some stage light. Both the electrical cords and the deflector panels on the lighting can contain asbestos. Here's a laptop you could encounter in a chemistry lab. Even sports events can be impacted by asbestos materials. Here's an example of a basketball backboard that's got an asbestos spray backing. Because of its acoustical properties, you can find transite panels, spray-on or plaster materials in theaters or auditoriums. Asbestos is primarily known for its insulating properties and was heavily marketed. Different forms of pipe insulation are not uncommon in older buildings such as air cell, or preformed mag, thermal system insulation, or fire felts. Asbestos can be found in many boiler components such as refractory brick, mortar, door gaskets, seals, mag block, and lag cloth. Here's an example of a boiler door. Here's some furnace cement. And here's some refractory cement on a chimney. The backside of decorative flue covers may contain an asbestos coating. There are some materials where most people would be surprised to find asbestos had been used. Here's an example of a water tank on this toilet. It's made of a cast asbestos containing material. Here are some coating materials underneath bathtubs and sinks. Here's some items you could find in your home. Here's a barbecue vent. The paper sleeve and the nozzle of this hairdryer contains asbestos. The silver-colored paper inside this toaster behind the heating element also contains asbestos. Here's a paint ad from an asbestos paint manufacturer. Asbestos paint was used in many industrial settings. Asbestos has been added to concrete used in products including airport runways and roof decking. The asbestos was added to reduce cracking of the concrete. In the 50s, a cigarette company developed their new micronite filter that was actually endorsed by the American Medical Association. These new cigarette filters were improved by the addition of crucidolite, or blue asbestos fibers. Here's a close-up of a micronite filter. Finally, after developing lung cancer or an asbestos-related disease from smoking or asbestos exposure, what better way to go out than in an asbestos casket? Thanks for watching today's video. If you're a field inspector, you will no doubt encounter additional suspect materials or issues. We hope the video provides some information to make your inspections easier and safer. Thanks again for watching.
For more information about the asbestos regulations, contact the Missouri Department of Natural Resources at 800-361-4827.